am 20, and I have a younger brother who's currently 18, and he will turn 19 this August. So we're all very close in age, and we're all super tight. And so we were having a conversation before dinner time, like as my mom and dad was getting dinner ready, that kind of trickled into dinner room conversation. Have you ever had that before? If you guys are parents or if you guys are siblings, you hear like the little end note of what your kids are saying, and then you're like, oh, so what were you just talking about? And like most of the times you're like, oh, it's nothing. Don't worry about it. And then you're caught with like, oh, what happened in school today? And so, but what had happened was, my dad was like, wait, what were you just talking about? And my brother, sister, and I, like for some reason, decided, okay, like we'll actually divulge and talk about what we were actually talking about. And so the topic of the conversation at the time was who we were going to marry, or basically who was our dream girl, dream guy. And specifically, we were talking about my brother because it happened to be around the time of his prom. And so he was talking about like, oh, I don't know who to ask, and like I could ask this person, but I don't know. And so as we're talking about this at the dinner table, my dad was like, what are you talking about? Now I'm just going to become a priest. And so as we're joking about, and so, and it's all fun and games at this point. It's a very light, funny conversation. And then this hush kind of falls over at the dinner table, and my dad gets this very serious face, and then he turns to my sister and I, and he goes, I would really like it if at least one of you married within the culture. And so my sister and I are looking at each other and we're like, oh man, this is what? And my sister quickly takes her finger and puts it on her nose, looks at me and goes, nose goes. And so basically she just threw it on my plate like, you're the sister that definitely has to go and marry the culture, find a Vietnamese guy that happens to be Catholic and make dad happy. And so like when she did this, my dad turns to me and just jokingly, not in any serious manner, looks at me and was like, thanks for doing that for me. Like, I really appreciate it. And so I'm sitting there at the dinner table and I'm thinking, what is culture? Like, what is my culture? What is it that I'm supposed to look out in other people? What is it in myself that I'm supposed to find to, supposedly make my parents happy? And so I wrestled with this question, and it's really hard to define. And I think for a lot of people, I teach, I'm a catechist for St. Francis Cathedral, and when we get to certain units about culture, I look around the classroom like, guys, what's culture? And then you see a lot of kids who come from seemingly, quote-unquote, white families. I'm like, Miss Lucia, I don't have a culture. And I'm like, of course you do. Everyone has a culture, but it's really hard to define what culture actually is. So I need to ask you guys, being who you are, what is culture? Shout an answer. Don't make me feel awkward. Just anything that seems incredibly obvious, or maybe you don't even know this.
Traditions.
Traditions? Okay, great. Traditions.
Behaviors.
Behaviors, that's excellent. Language, perfect. Yes. Food. Okay, that's part of culture. Food. Anything else? There's gotta be more. Music.
Arts.
Arts, great. Literature.
Dress.
Fashion, perfect. What else?
Time.
Good, that's very good. Just concepts of reality, basically. So, I was going to do this really cool activity, but I think for time, yeah, so I'm not going to do it. Okay, so I'm actually an anthropology minor, and so the best definition that I found for culture is based off James Bradley. He wrote this great book called Conformity and Conflict, and he explains it as the learned and shared knowledge that people use to generate behavior and interpret experience. So I felt like that was right on the nail, because that doesn't include any arts or any literature and any things that could seemingly block or create these boundaries. It's just this. It's learned because, whether or not you consciously pass it on or unconsciously, people learn it. They develop it. They, get it integrated into it, and then it's shared because it's not something that one person has. It's widespread. And then it's a body of knowledge. It's just this huge surplus of knowledge and different actions and things that we pass on that people use to generate behavior and interpret experience. And so with that, there's two, Bradley explains that there's two types of culture, and that goes down to explicit culture. And that is what Marilyn explained as the tip of the iceberg. This is stuff that is seemingly obvious. It's written down. Like, even when you walk onto a bus, for example, all people have to stand behind the yellow line. Like, you can't be above that line. That, for example, would be explicit culture, because it's written. It's very obvious. You can touch it, you can feel it, you can read it. But on the other hand, if we go back to these notions of what it means to generate behavior and interpret experience, you have this other dimension of culture, which is tacit culture. And all of that is the tricky stuff. That is the stuff that isn't obvious. It's little things like how close you can be to a person when you're talking to them, or how firm your handshake should be when you first meet them. Little things like that. And within a single culture, there's like social culture in the sense of like what it is to be in media. There's the traditional heritage, ethnic culture, but it's these two dimensions that make it really hard to intermingle sometimes. So as a first-generation American, being that both my parents are refugees and that I'm born here in America, I find it difficult to sometimes separate what is explicit culture within the Vietnamese culture and what it is with the American culture, and same thing on the tacit aspect. So the best way that I can kind of tell my story or explain this phenomenon, what it is to be a cultural person, is just through my own story. So I talked to a lot of different people about this before I gave and made this presentation, and for the most part, a lot of my friends feel like they're on the same page. So hopefully I'm not only speaking for myself when I continue on. All right, so here I am at the tender age of, I don't know how old I was, but I was here with my mom and my dad, and the little church at St. Teresa where he first spoke about, that is where I was baptized. And so I remember when I'm a catechist and I teach my kids, I always tell them that baptism was not your choice. You're a baby, you don't know anything, so your parents choose to baptize you and raise you as a Catholic. And so my parents made that decision for me. And so as I'm growing up, here I am.
Aww.
All right, do you notice anything about my doll?
Yeah.
Exactly. Okay, so here, like growing up, I had no notions that I was Asian. I had no, like, I look in the mirror, whatever, I hold my doll. It's like we're basically the same thing. I'm the mom, she's my baby. But this notion of like, the doll had blonde hair and blue eyes, and she's my baby. We look exactly the same. And so like, I grew up with this notion of not really knowing that I was different from anyone else. And that wasn't my parents' fault. It was just, if there's a doll and there's not really Asian dolls out there that I can know, I've been to a couple toy stores here and there, it just is what it is. So then I went to school, and that's when I was first exposed to this notion of like, wow, there's other people out there. But even at the same time, I think kids have a way of not really pointing out those differences. They can see past them completely. And that was something that I did. And I know that Julian brought up how, I just called him Julin. That's one of the titles that he was talking about, how there's a ton of different titles. His name is Lin, but I have to call him Julin, so that he's older than me. Anyway. But, so he talks about how, when kids first go to school, that's, as a first-generation American, that's almost your first exposure to English. I mean, you get a little bit of TV, but most of the time at home, you speak Vietnamese with your parents. Like my first language, only Vietnamese. I literally walked into kindergarten that first day. I went to St. Francis Cathedral in Metuchen. No idea what was going on. Literally. Like the teacher, I think, had to just move me there because she couldn't just say, go there so you can take a picture. I literally sat there and I was like, I have no idea what's going on. So it wasn't until like she took my hand, walked me over, and made a smile motion, and I was like, oh, okay, so she's gonna take a picture. And that's what happened. But at this point in my household, English was something that my parents really pushed us to learn, because my sister, who's a year older at this point, she's in the first grade, because this is my kindergarten picture, she comes home after a day of school. I think this must have been about 3 weeks into school. She sits at the dinner table and in Vietnamese asks my parents, what does stupid mean? Mm-hmm. And so, my dad was like, why? Where'd you pick that one up? And she was like, oh, my sister just had no idea. So my sister's like, oh, some kids at school just call me stupid. And was like, was there a reason? And my sister, nonchalantly, not even realizing, that this was something derogatory or even belittling, was just kind of like, oh, I don't know, I guess I just couldn't understand something. And that was the point where my dad was like, all right, kids, look into myself, my little brother was like, you guys gotta learn English because this isn't cool. This isn't gonna fly. So I went through kindergarten, first grade, and second grade through ESL classes. And it wasn't until third grade that I finally got off ESL classes. But here, I was still under this notion of naive realism. And anthropologists call naive realism as this perspective of someone who thinks that everyone else thinks the same way that they do. And it wasn't even like ethnocentrism where it's like, ooh, like my thoughts are better than yours. It's like, oh, everyone just sees the same way that I do. And so I basically went through the majority of my elementary school years not really noticing any cultural differences or not even realizing, because I kept on thinking like, well, these kids probably went to ESL classes when they were 2 or 3. Like, I just hung out all the time at home. So I went on with this notion, and even through school, that's what I kind of concentrated on, or that's how I viewed the world. And through faith formation, because I went through a Catholic elementary school, I got my sacraments. Does everyone know what's an ordeal? It was really epic, bear hugs, and really warm welcome. So I learned everything that I did from St. Francis. And you move on, and here I am in the 4th grade. Do you notice anything about my doll? Again with my doll. All right, see, look, my doll is dark-skinned. I didn't care. I still had no idea that there were these notions of like race and differences, because I just always thought like, hey, I have black hair. Like that is it. Like there's nothing different about any of us. And it wasn't until middle school where I started feeling awkward, because there was a girl in the 5th grade. Love her, she's one of my best friends. She had moved over from California, blonde hair, blue-eyed, basically what she probably looked like my doll when she was an infant. And she came up to me and she asked me, she's like, do you ever wish you were blonde? And I was like, no, not really, because why would I? And then all of a sudden it dawned on me that we are different. And it was something that didn't even come as like a negative realization, but just something that became really obvious. Like, oh, like we are different because we all come from different families and different cultures. It's not so much this notion of this grand melting pot, because that's all it was taught through our elementary school. In America, it's this grand melting pot that we all just kind of mix and mold together, and this is why we're all different. But so, like once I realized that during middle school, and middle school is just awkward for obvious reasons, but on top of that, that's when I started to realize that I had a culture that was different, because around middle school is when you start setting up those play dates with your friends, and I was embarrassed to bring my friends over, because it wasn't like I could go over to my friend's house and they'd have, you know, soda and chips and cookies, and like they would go to my house, and I felt awkward because I'm like, oh, my friends think it's weird if they have to take off their shoes, and like my mom doesn't have soda, but she has tons of really sweet teas, and we don't have like chips or cookies, but we have tropical fruit, and it was just like this weird thing where like I didn't want to bring my friends over because I suddenly felt really awkward. It suddenly occurred to me that I was really different from everyone else. And so as I moved on, here's me in all my awkward glory in middle school, and so and this is just kind of weird because I know it's really hard for middle school kids in general to just fit in. It's like the most difficult thing. And I'm not even sure if kids are just mean at this age or whatever it is. They're just awful. And so, like for example, my mom would pack me lunch to school every day. And so like every so often she'd throw like a Vietnamese food in there. And I would feel embarrassed to like open it and eat my lunch because I was like, oh crap, like these kids are gonna call me out for not having peanut butter and jelly. And like all I wanted was, oh mom, like why can't you get fruit roll-ups and gusher snacks? Like, and then it's weird though because, and I didn't want to bring it up to my parents because this is something they're really proud of. This is their culture. This is what, you know, both my parents are refugees. This is what they left their motherland for, and they're proud of it. And so for their kids to turn around and be like, can you not embarrass me by like packing these foods or acting the way that you do when my friends come over? So, but I never brought that up to my parents, and neither did my sister or my brother, mostly because we knew how important culture was to them. So we kind of like treaded this really fine line. And every so often, like my brother would bring it up, like, Mom, don't pack that. And she'll just think like, oh, you don't like it anymore, that's okay. So she would stop buying it. And then my sister and I would be like, no, we love that, we just don't want it for lunch. And it was one of those things where like you had to like pick and choose, and it was just really hard because we weren't necessarily ashamed of our culture when it was in the house. we loved eating those foods, we loved watching those movies, talking those things, singing those songs, but it was only like when you went outside of your house, and all of a sudden it was just not the norm that we felt really embarrassed. But so as awkward as I was in the social realm of making friends, having friends come over, I was also very lucky because I went to a Catholic school where faith was just huge. Faith was one of those things that brought a lot of us together. So again, you know, Father John Gloss, he's over there. He's great. He's one of my favorite priests ever. And this is during our 7th grade mass where what happens is we put a huge mass together. And this is where I felt the most comfortable because it was like, all right, like even though I'm different, I'm Catholic, you're Catholic, this is where we can actually talk about something mutual and I don't have to be afraid. We both go to church, both do the same things, we all have communion. This is cool. And so what Father John did was he started a youth group, and here is the St. Francis Middle School Youth Group, which I love dearly, and I cannot thank this man and this group enough because I think what happens is that in middle school, you're on the pursuit of what's cool. And like everyone is on that pursuit. No one wants to be the loser. No one even wants to be even left out. Like you can come home and have a really bad day. Your whole entire family feels it. So like this notion of going to youth group and having faith be cool, I thought that was great. So in this case, faith became synonymous with friends. And like my parents thought this was great. It was like, you know, they're devout Catholics and I thought that was awesome that I can find friends through my faith, when it was so awkward to be Vietnamese and find friends that way. So through the transitive property, by having friends because of faith, you're cool. And then so youth group became the coolest thing. And I can't even begin to tell you how like Friday nights there's a youth group meeting on Sunday, he would be like, are you going to youth group? Yes, I'm going to youth group. And it just became this really cool thing to do. And so, you know, faith, through the transitive property is, you know, synonymous with being cool. And that was the first time I ever realized that, okay, so there's one aspect of my life that I don't have to necessarily hide. And I think it did have to come with being in a Catholic school, because I know that I talked to a lot of my other friends who go to public schools, and they said faith is something very hard to, you know, be active about. It's not cool. Exactly. Like it's just like, yeah, it's like it's not super cool. Like if you're going to tell your friends that you're going to go to a youth group meeting instead of a movie, yikes. Like that is just a sign of not being cool. But I was lucky because I feel like instead of it could have been anything. So then I started, after I graduated St. Francis, I did not continue on with my Catholic schooling. I decided to go over to public school. So I ended up going to Metuchen High School, where I loved it. It was one of the greatest 4 years of my entire life. Not that I've lived that long to really know. It's still awesome. So here's one of those things where I had a lot of different interests, and it wasn't what's considered stereotypically Asian. So one, I'm terrible at math. I cannot play musical instruments to save my life. I can't sing either, but I was into things like mock trial, Malioen. I love that kind of stuff. I was into the plays and dramas, but not actual acting. I love the set work behind the scenes, doing tech stuff. And so, like, when my friends that I made in high school used to joke, like, you're not really Asian, Lucia, because I was in average math and like all those kind of things. I was in orchestra. So I was kept on thinking, I was like, all right, this is kind of cool. Like, I'm really fitting in, so I don't mind being this not really Asian. So, but then it suddenly occurred to me, I was like, all right, can you be cool if you have culture too? Like, is there a way that I can just make this work? Because my parents were even commenting about how I was slowly losing my culture. They're like, oh, you just only care about, you know, your friends and all this other stuff, and like you never go to church if you'd rather go to English mass instead of Vietnamese mass. And so I was kind of in a precarious situation. And so, sorry about that. All right, so then this notion of, can culture be cool too? I joined the youth group at St. James, the Vietnamese community, and this is where I learned that yes, culture can be cool too. And this is where it's cool because you have this trifecta of like faith, friends, and culture, and it's not something that you have to be too ashamed of. It's different here because you have something that everyone can relate to each other in the sense that we're all kind of going through the same struggles. And what had happened was that even though we were a Catholic youth group, we were just so close in terms of our friendship that we actually started picking people up that weren't Catholic but were Vietnamese. and they wanted to somehow like be involved in the culture, even if it meant that they weren't involved in faith. So if you look at the first couple kids in the front row, the gentleman in the mint green shirt and the black tie, he's not Catholic, and the person sitting next to him is not Catholic as well. And throughout just basically our, since I've been in youth group, we have people coming in who are just looking for friendship, and just having faith be kind of like a background notion that they'll sit quietly to and listen to what we have to talk about, but they don't maybe actively participate or believe in. All right, pressing our buttons here. Okay, so yes, culture is cool. And this is where I developed this different mindset, where I'm switching over from naive realism to cultural relativism. And cultural relativism is this notion that every culture is relative. So not one is better than the other, it really is all relative. And so, you think about Albert Einstein, what he has to say about relativity, talk to a girl, it seems like forever, or no, like minutes, and then hot stove, it seems like forever. So I understand it's just basically all relative. It's just all, nothing is better, nothing is worse, it's just really based on your own perspective of things. So, through these events, like here we are, this is after we put together a huge egg hunt after Easter Mass. The congregation basically feeds us, and it's great because here you have a bunch of people. This is like, I don't have to feel awkward about eating cultural food. Like where my friends would come over, I'd be like, oh no, Mom, you can't serve that. Like we should order a pizza. This is like, oh, everyone can eat this because we know what's going on. And then here is our group during one of our Christmas parties. You don't realize it, but we're actually in someone's basement. So we don't actually have the facility to host these huge youth group things like a lot of other communities are blessed to have. So we generally go over to someone's house. So imagine cramming about like 30 kids into basically your living room. And this is what we try to do basically every single time we had a meeting. Luckily, like we've grown and we've been able to use the community room over at St. James, but this is where we started. And we're only laying on the ground because we couldn't fit everyone in the picture. And so we decided, we were trying to figure out like a photo, so we were like, oh, like everyone should just stand up and squish and kneel, and it just didn't work. So we just all lay down on the floor, and this is the only way that everyone can get captured. And I don't think everyone is. I feel like we have stragglers on the side. So then from here, we started hanging out outside of youth group, and this is actually at someone's Sweet 16. So it was one of those things where it was like, okay, you know how you have groups in school you only talk to in school. You only talk to if you play the sport for the season, then you don't talk to them outside of it. And this was different. This was something where we really formed a strong friendship based on our culture and our faith that we can do things outside of church. And then here I am. I finally officially graduated high school. I'm all in my cultural relativism and just energetic and just all ready to go to school. And this is really basically what everyone calls the downfall of youth group. And it's not necessarily something bad, it's just you have a group of people that leave for college, and it's hard to have them come back. But one of the goals that I tried to do was just to always come back. And it was one of those things where I just went to Rutgers, I still go to Rutgers, and I live close by, so I always try to go at least a couple meetings here and there, at least the big events. But when I went over to Rutgers, I was again in like the most diverse university ever. And you have this idea of the great American melting pot. And this kind of sits a little bit, I don't know, uncomfortably with me a little bit, only because there's this notion of melting. When you think of melting, you don't think of things keeping their shape. You think of everything molding into like a single identity. I was like, do I really want that for myself? What kind of sacrifices, what do I have to give up about my culture to be part of this great American melting pot? Like, what are we melting into? This ideal American, but in this ideal American, like, what, do I have to only speak English? Do I have to only believe in like certain parties? Do I have to be a Protestant Christian? Like, what am I melting into at this moment? And so, like, my first couple years in college, especially when everyone's very open about their religion, they like discourse and discussion. This was something that I've learned that I disagree with this completely, and I totally understand why. Being in elementary school, I've lived more than half my life from this naive, realistic perspective. Is because, we're kind of taught to just mix and mold into each other, and you kind of lose your identity because of that. And so, as much as I think it's great to be able to live in this great country and coexist and integrate and be friendly with each other, I'm also a firm believer that it's very important to hold on to your actual culture. To not actually melt into this I don't know, substance, but I guess to still maintain your identity, like a stew. Like you got your carrots, and carrots are still carrots, and potatoes are still potatoes, all that kind of stuff. So from there, I've just returned back year after year, and it's just year after year, and this was the most recent one. And it's always good to come back. And so what I've learned from my whole experience as part of the Vietnamese community here is about cultural reflexivity and the art of belonging. So there's this notion that everyone says in college, you can only choose two. So it's either like you're gonna do really well in school, and then you get enough sleep, then you don't have a social life, or you get a social life and good grades, but then you just don't sleep. And so there's this notion of you only have to choose two. And for the longest part, I was always thinking that that was kind of the same thing. Like, oh, I have to choose two. I could either have my friends and have faith, and then, or either have my friends and my culture, or then my faith and my culture. But then what I've learned from this whole experience, and especially being in college and being able to make the friends that I'm friends with and still maintain my relationship with St. Francis. I'm still very active. I'm still a catechist with St. Francis Cathedral, and I still work with the youth there. And then within my own youth group here, where even though I'm not a youth leader, I still love to come back and participate. There's this cool thing where faith, friends, and culture actually works all together in this concentric circle, and like I don't have to give up anything. And I think that's something that's really cool about growing up here as a first-generation American with parents who have come with struggles. It creates a lot of really good conversation, and I think that based on my own teaching experience and just peer-on-peer conversation, a lot of people who seem to think that they don't have culture of their own, it's always really good to have this discourse and conversation. So I really just owe a lot of thanks to the Vietnamese community and basically to that whole process of gaining the perspective that I did, strictly because of my culture.